Oscar Wilde was more than a man, he was a phenomenon. By the late 19th century, he had become one of the most celebrated playwrights in London. With his razor-sharp wit, flamboyant fashion, and dazzling presence, Wilde dominated not just the stage, but the cultural imagination of Victorian society. But behind the applause and champagne-filled evenings, Wilde carried a dangerous secret. A secret that, in the eyes of the law, could ruin everything he had built. At a time when society adored his genius, it also enforced strict laws about morality, especially concerning same-sex relationships. And for Wilde, a man who lived more openly than most dared, this dangerous tension would soon lead to his downfall. The glittering world of Oscar Wilde would become the backdrop for one of the most shocking trials of the century, one that blended crime, scandal, and punishment in equal measure. Stay tuned as we uncover how the life of one of history's greatest writers spiraled into a courtroom drama that shocked Victorian England. Wilde was married, with 2 young sons he loved dearly. But in the 1890s, he began a relationship that would destroy him. His lover was Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie, a young, impulsive poet. Bosie was beautiful, reckless, and dangerously proud. Unlike Wilde, who navigated society's expectations with wit and subtlety, Bosie flaunted his desires without care for the consequences. Their affair was passionate, but it drew attention. In an era when homosexuality was not just frowned upon but considered a criminal offense, their closeness became a weapon for Wilde's enemies. And Bosie's father, the powerful and vindictive Marquis of Queensberry, was determined to expose Wilde and ruin him. This was not simply a family dispute. It was the spark that would ignite one of the most notorious trials in British history. For Wilde, the danger should have been clear. The Marquis of Queensberry was known for his violent temper and his relentless pursuit of scandal. He accused Wilde of corrupting his son and threatened him openly in letters and confrontations. Friends begged Wilde to distance himself from Bosie. They warned him that the Marquis was ruthless and that society would not protect him. But Wilde, proud and defiant, refused to yield. He believed his brilliance and status would shield him. He underestimated the venom of his enemies and overestimated the tolerance of a society steeped in hypocrisy. Soon, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Queensberry was preparing a public attack, and Wilde, instead of stepping back, would make a fateful choice, one that would turn a personal feud into a criminal trial. On February 18, 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry left a calling card at Wilde's London club. On it, scrawled in a rage-filled hand, were the words, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." It was a public insult designed to shame Wilde, to brand him with a criminal accusation that could not be ignored. Wilde's friends urged caution. They told him to walk away, to let it go. But Wilde, enraged and unwilling to be humiliated, saw another path. He decided to sue Queensberry for libel. This would prove disastrous. In choosing the courtroom as his battlefield, Wilde believed he could use his eloquence and charm to defend himself. Instead, he walked straight into the trap his enemies had set. The trial of Wilde versus Queensberry began in April 1895. At first, Wilde dazzled. His wit electrified the courtroom. When asked if he had kissed a young man, he replied with a quip that made the gallery laugh. His confidence, his command of language, it all seemed unshakable. But this was no stage play. The stakes were higher than Wilde imagined. Queensberry's lawyers came armed with evidence, letters, testimonies, and accusations of Wilde's relationships with younger men. Each revelation stripped away Wilde's carefully constructed defense. What began as Wilde's attempt to silence Queensberry quickly turned into a trial of Wilde himself. The libel case collapsed. But worse was to come. Instead of freedom, Wilde now faced criminal charges. The collapse of Wilde's libel case left him exposed. Queensberry had not only won, but had handed over damning evidence to the authorities. Within days, Wilde was arrested on charges of gross indecency, the legal term for same-sex relations. The man who had once commanded the London stage now faced prison, disgrace, and the destruction of his legacy. When Wilde was taken into custody, the press erupted. Newspapers that once praised his genius now turned on him, filling their pages with scandal, moral outrage, and cruelty. Wilde, once celebrated, was now condemned. The stage was set for one of the most infamous criminal trials in British history. Wilde's first criminal trial opened in April 1895. The prosecution painted him as a predator, a man who corrupted young men with wealth, charm, and promises of luxury. The defense, meanwhile, tried to shield Wilde, emphasizing the lack of direct evidence. Wilde himself spoke with brilliance, but his words no longer charmed. His wit, once his greatest weapon, was now twisted against him, painted as arrogance and deceit. The jury could not reach a verdict. It was a hung jury. For a moment, Wilde had hope, but the government was determined. A second trial was ordered. The second trial was even more brutal. The prosecution's case was sharpened, the accusations clearer, the witnesses bolder. Wilde, visibly weakened, struggled to maintain his former composure. The defense could no longer rely on his charm. Instead, they begged for mercy, arguing that Wilde's art, his reputation, and his suffering should be considered. But the tide had turned. The press had whipped the public into outrage. Society wanted punishment, not poetry. When the verdict came, it was devastating, guilty. Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, the maximum penalty. Prison for Wilde was not just confinement, it was torment. Hard labor broke his body. Deprivation crushed his spirit. He was denied paper and pen for months, stripped of the very tools that gave his life meaning. The man who once dined with royalty and captivated theaters now spent his days breaking rocks, picking oakum, and enduring the relentless grind of prison routines. His health declined. He grew frail, his spirit dimmed. The world outside moved on, but Wilde remained trapped, punished not just for his actions, but for daring to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity. Yet even in prison, Wilde's mind worked. From the depths of despair, he began to craft words that would later form one of the most powerful works of his career. In prison, Wilde wrote a long, searing letter to Bosie, later published as De Profundis. It was not just a letter, but a confession, an indictment, and a meditation on suffering. Wilde poured out his grief, his love, his anger, and his reflections on art, life, and spirituality. He admitted his own flaws, but also condemned the cruelty of a society that destroyed him. The letter was a cry from the depths, a portrait of a broken man who still clung to the power of words. When it was finally read by the world, it became clear. Prison had not destroyed Wilde's voice. It had given him a new one, raw, wounded, but unforgettable. In May 1897, after serving his full sentence, Oscar Wilde walked out of prison a free man. But freedom was only in name. His health was broken. His fortune was gone. His reputation, once dazzling, was now in ashes. His wife, Constance, had taken their 2 sons abroad and changed their names to escape the scandal. Friends had drifted away, afraid of their own reputations. Wilde was no longer the celebrated genius of London's theatres. He was a man shunned, whispered about, and cast aside. With nowhere to go in England, Wilde left for France. He would never again set foot on British soil. In Paris, Wilde lived under assumed names, moving from cheap hotel to cheap hotel, always in debt, always drinking, always longing for the life he had lost. Yet even in exile, Wilde could not escape the shadow of his trial. Strangers recognized him. Some mocked him openly in cafes. Others avoided him altogether, as if his very presence carried scandal. But Wilde still sought companionship. Despite their destructive past, he reunited with Bosie for a time. Their love, however, was poisoned by resentment, poverty, and blame. Their reunion ended in more bitterness than comfort. Wilde was exiled not just from his homeland, but from the society he once ruled. Though broken, Wilde still had one masterpiece left. In 1898, he published the Ballad of Reading Gaol, a haunting poem inspired by his prison years. It was not about wit, nor about glittering salons. It was about suffering, punishment, and the humanity of prisoners. Wilde wrote of men condemned, of the cruelty of the system, and of a fellow inmate who was executed while Wilde was imprisoned. The poem struck a deep chord with readers. For a moment, the world remembered Wilde not as a scandal, but as a poet who gave voice to pain. It was his final triumph. After the Ballad of Reading Gaol, Wilde never wrote another major work. His health continued to worsen. Years of hard labor, poverty, and drinking left him frail. Friends described him as a ghost of his former self. His flamboyance faded into quiet melancholy. He wandered Parisian streets, often in the same worn clothes, speaking of his past glories with a wistful smile. The man who once commanded the attention of London's elite now lived on the edge of obscurity, relying on the charity of a few loyal friends. The decline was slow, tragic, and relentless. By 1900, Wilde was gravely ill. He suffered from meningitis, brought on by an ear infection that had never healed. On his deathbed, he kept his humor, even as pain consumed him. One of his last recorded remarks was about the wallpaper in his shabby Paris hotel room. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." On November 30th, 1900, Oscar Wilde died at the age of 46. Alone, disgraced, and poor, he passed quietly in a foreign land. The man who had once been the toast of Victorian England was buried in a small cemetery in Paris, his grave unmarked for years. In the years after Wilde's death, society remembered him less for his plays and more for his scandal. His name became a warning, a whispered cautionary tale about pride, sin, and punishment. Parents told their children not to follow his path. His works were seldom staged. His image was one of ruin, a man undone by arrogance and immorality, or so the world claimed. But beneath that shame, a different truth lingered. Wilde had been punished not for theft, nor for violence, but for love. His trial exposed not just his life, but the cruelty of a society that criminalized affection between men. Slowly, his story began to shift from scandal to tragedy. By the mid-20th century, the world began to see Oscar Wilde differently. His plays returned to the stage. His wit was quoted once more. Scholars revisited his works, uncovering layers of genius previously overshadowed by scandal. But more importantly, Wilde became a symbol of injustice. His suffering highlighted the cruelty of laws against same-sex love. Activists began to claim Wilde as a martyr, someone whose brilliance was crushed by a system that could not tolerate difference. His name, once spoken in whispers, was now spoken in pride. The man they tried to erase had returned, stronger than ever. In 2017, more than a century after his death, the British government issued a formal pardon for Oscar Wilde and thousands of others convicted under the same outdated laws. The pardon was symbolic, but powerful. It was an acknowledgement that Wilde had been wronged, that the crime for which he suffered should never have been a crime at all. For Wilde's legacy, it was a victory long overdue. The man who had died disgraced was finally recognized as a victim of injustice. The trial of Oscar Wilde was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a clash between genius and prejudice, between art and hypocrisy, between a man's truth and a society's fear. Wilde's downfall revealed the dangers of pride, but also the brutality of laws designed to police love. His story is not just about scandal, it's about the human cost of prejudice. Wilde was punished for who he was, not for what he did. And that truth lingers like an open wound in the history of justice. Oscar Wilde once said, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple." His life proved that. His trial was not just about law. It was about society's fear of difference, its hunger for scandal, and its willingness to destroy brilliance when it did not conform. As we reflect on Wilde's fate, we must ask ourselves, how many others were silenced, erased, or destroyed by prejudice disguised as justice? If you believe stories like Wilde's deserve to be remembered, shared, and learned from, make sure to like this video, subscribe to True Crime Hub, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most haunting trials. Because behind every scandal, there is a story. And behind every punishment, there is a truth waiting to be told.